to the Divine Council Worldview podcast. In this episode, Mike and I will be tackling the subject of what is called the two powers in heaven controversy that is originally found in the Mishnah and then the Talmud, going back to the 2nd through 4th centuries, basically, by Jewish rabbis, but then discussed by Dr. Heiser in various places in his work, including the Awakening School. So welcome back, Mike. Mike does have a course in Awakenings, I think even titled The Two Powers in Heaven. Am I right?
Correct. It's an Awakening course that Dr. Heiser had recorded prior to his passing. He was able to get out 2 additional courses while he was still in the midst of chemo. And I had recently finished it myself, and it's an excellent course.
Mm-hmm. And I took it too. So
yeah. It was interesting just to see and hear Mike again. And then like one thing that I told my wife a few days ago about that was really kind of funny. It just always reminded me about Mike was that at the start of the course, he seemed a little tired. I mean, it's the beginning. Oh my goodness, you're trying to get
you could tell he was battling his chemo.
Yeah. But as the course went on, he got more and more energetic, more enlivened as he's discussing the material. And it was just so good to see Dr. Heiser, even despite all of the challenges that comes with chemo and radiation, the fact that he could muster so much energy and his excitement was so palpable. It was really cool to see that despite the progress of the disease and the treatment, it didn't deter his enthusiasm or his passion for the subjects.
I did feel badly for him as soon as, you start the course, you realize, boy, he's struggling, but his passion, which some use against Mike. I mean, we've talked about this before, Mike, but Dr. Heiser is sometimes oddly, in my sightlines, criticized for his enthusiasm for his subject, as though as somebody has famously said, all he does is talk about other gods. Well, the point is that was Mike's subject, and if I'm at a car dealer who deals in Cadillacs, I expect him to talk about Cadillacs, right, endlessly, and I'm not going to fault him for that. And so when I hear Mike talk about other gods with bombosity, or what word do we want to put there? I don't criticize him at all, and I think that was his role. So let's get into it. This topic, the two powers in heaven controversy, like many discussions, has been around for centuries, obviously going back to the rabbinic works of the first centuries, but has largely been missed, ignored maybe. I'm not sure what word to put there, Mike, because and I even struggle in thinking, why have Christians missed this discussion? And I'll talk about, and we both will talk about bibliography in a bit, what books that we've read on this and so forth. But I don't know. I always wonder, because this does come up as a common DCW conversation. Why haven't I heard about this before? Was Mike being novel? Those kind of things. Here's my thought, Mike, and I invite your response. Theology runs surprisingly in fads, in trends. I mean, when you would hope that we would be above that, but kind of like the bell bottoms of the 60s, that go out of fashion and come back, whatever. You realize, I think, and I spent just a few thoughts or just a little bit of time thinking about this in preparation for this podcast. In fact, it was like process theology. That's been around for a long time. I mean, going back decades. But it took a book by Greg Boyd in the mid-90s, Letters from a Skeptic, page 31, for him to have a letter between him and his father. And he said that God doesn't know the future. And I'm paraphrasing. Well, that hits the fan. And then by the time you get to the late 90s, okay, so it takes a couple of years. But I remember living through this as a teacher at a Christian school that, the does God know the future question, open theism we called it at that point, was everywhere. And it was at ETS. It was, we were kicking people out of ETS during that time, or we being that was the question. Can we have people as members of the Evangelical Theological Society who believe in open theism? Was an open question because it had hit the fan. It was trendy, right? Same thing then, I think there's probably other examples you could think of, but the one that immediately comes to mind is the new perspective on Paul. We have a debate of three different men at ETS one year, N.T. Wright, Frank Thielman, and I forget the third. But, why was it a debate that took up hours of ETS, plenary discussion? Was because the new perspective on Paul had finally, shall we say, become faddish, trendy. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, when you read about it, they say, well, this started back in the 60s with Christopher Stendahl, or 1977 with E.P. Sanders' book. So we all can say, well, it's been around. And then we all, at least I was saying to myself, well, why are we talking about it now in 2009? What is it about this time that makes it more valuable than back in the 60s? And I think quick answer then would be, don't be surprised, and I say this to our audience, don't be surprised as a lay theologian to find out that theology is very faddish. It comes in cycles, it comes in trends, it comes because Luther brings it up, we get a Reformation. Again, had he not had the personality he did and have the ideas that he had, we may never have had it as we know it today. So I'm not bothered, Mike, by the idea that the two powers in heaven controversy, or even the divine council worldview as an idea that we, again, are spending our time in on this podcast, that it has, been under the surface, but just because it never hit the fan. And now, because of Dr. Heiser, it did. So what do you think?
I think it's I normally wouldn't use the word faddish. I would say it's I think over time there are these correctives that comes to the church overall. And this is coming from like a confessional or believing perspective on theology. I do see, Luther being a good case, the Reformation, all the circumstances that surrounded the time of the Reformation. It really was starting to become a ripe environment where people were rethinking and re-examining what they had just assumed. And they assumed it because they didn't have any additional information. Mm-hmm. And until they started seeing the Greek manuscripts, until you had Aramaeus, I think that was his name, who came out with his own translation of the New Testament based on Greek manuscripts, mm-hmm. Outside of the Vatican, outside of the official Vulgate, that people started to finally pay attention to, did Paul actually mean this? And so I think that's what's interesting, is that things such as the new perspective on Paul it's following along in the same ideas of the Reformation, of like, we want to always be going back to the text, but people had then become so accustomed to how the text had been explained that once mm-hmm. they hear something new, there is always an air of suspicion or skepticism that will be encountered. Yeah. And I think the challenge, especially when it comes to like the two powers idea or divine council worldview, is in many ways, and I think I said this before on our podcast, that we are victims of the churches, of at least the Western churches' own success. I remember one of my first professors at Gordon, he talked about how technically, like ironically, the church did win the battle of the gods, at least in the West. Right, the talk of pagan gods also got relegated to just mythologies and stories that are taught in the classics, but they don't exist. They're not real. And essentially, Western Christianity had won the day in that it convinced pretty much the majority of folks in Europe there are no such thing as gods besides the one true God, the creator of all things. And ironically, because of that success, we are now so ill-equipped and ill-prepared for the resurgence of paganism in its various forms, whether it's in expressions like Wicca or in fascinations with Hinduism or Buddhism or other Eastern religions, that the church is now ill-equipped to deal with this kind of stuff because we had convinced ourselves other supernatural beings, for the most part, don't exist. Mm-hmm. And what the DCW and what even Two Powers is dealing with is that there is a whole entire peripheral whirl of supernatural beings that we really hadn't given much thought or paid attention to for the last 1,500 years.
Yeah. Well, since Aquinas, as you're talking there, I'm reliving my church history courses and things. And really, since Aquinas, we won, shall we say, the Western Church won. And so the debate or the thought for Aquinas was not, are there other gods, but what about this one? And everything, goes toward one God. And we were, we're not surprised that he never got to the question, Aquinas, of whether other gods existed. Well, what I'd like to do is, in preparation or in delivery of this discussion of two powers, which again has massive bibliography attached to it and a lot of history, I've put together an outline, and I just numbered my points for my own organization. I'm not trying to say we have to think in terms of numbers, but as I walk through this for our audience, and you, Mike, of course, I invite your response to my thoughts as I go. I'm backing all the way up and trying to think of where this all started, and then where we've come, where Dr. Heiser got involved, and where we then today, as a Divine Council Worldview group, would apply this thinking to our own thoughts. So I say 1, 2, and 3, but I'm just trying to keep my thoughts in order. So here we go. Number 1, all discussions about the spiritual world should be done with a measure of intellectual uneasiness. Well, I'd even say a great awareness of the unknown, right? I mean, as we get into, and this could go over every podcast we've had together, but when we talk about the spiritual world, it's not like the bottom of the ocean, which is a mystery to us, but at least we can get there. We're talking about a world that we cannot visit and come back from, right? So I know you agree with me, Mike, but I just like to always throw this out to people when we talk about Divine Council issues, or specifically the two powers in heaven discussion. We are venturing as humans into the unknown in a massive way. And so I always like to keep, as I hope we've done on our own podcast here, a sense of humility that we're doing our best, but good luck. It's just hard. Number 2, our goal is what is true, not what is helpful. I again love the work of C.S. Lewis, and this is the beginning of his essay called Man or Rabbit. Christianity claims to give an account of facts, to tell you what the real universe is like. Its account of the universe may be true, or it may not. And once the question is really before you, then your natural inquisitiveness must make you want to know the answer. If Christianity is untrue, then no honest man will want to believe it, however helpful it might be. If it is true, every honest man will want to believe it, even if it gives him no help at all. I love how honesty is there. And then what I think of in terms of a two powers in heaven discussion, that sits on top of that point. In other words, our first goal is to figure out, I think, responsibly, intellectually, is Christianity true? You and I have come to the decision it is. Now, on top of that, the next level of discussion, and thus the next level of difficulty or, possible mistakes and intellectual humility would be this question of, for our conversation today, two powers in heaven. Again, interrupt me at any point if you would like. Mm-hmm. Number 3, one rung up even from that is whether or not the two powers idea is true. Another way of thinking of this as the next level of discussion is, what does the Bible say? Because realizing the Bible will use its cultural norms in describing the spiritual world. So in other words, we have another level to battle through, and that is how the biblical textual record 2,000 some years ago defines the spiritual world that may not match. If it was being written today, it might use different metaphors, different analogies, that kind of thing. Number 4, the two powers in heaven question itself begins, if I can think chronologically, back in Genesis 1:1, with one creator and sustainer being given his primary place in our story. In other words, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, Elohim created. And that creation story, as we even did, on our own podcast here, it's a shot at the Mesopotamian and Egyptian creation myths where multiple gods created the world in various ways, sometimes through existing material, other times through sexual activity, things like that. So the Genesis 1:1 story, let's not lose sight of it as the basis for everything the text wants to say about this Elohim. He created, thus he sustains the world. And that's where the Mishnah and the Talmud is going to jump at, saying, guys, we have one Elohim. His name is Yahweh, and he is the creator and sustainer. Number 5. Are you good so far, Mike? Nothing really to debate, I hope, but
no, there's no debate. But I think your last point is one part that I think we have to remind people about the importance, because I've noticed I've had to actually mention this many times in my own sermons at my church, that the concept that Yahweh is the ultimate creator, that itself is why people followed him, was that they came to the conclusion he is the creator. And that is something that is exhorted throughout the scriptures, like the Psalms, reminding the people in song that Yahweh is the creator. And I don't know if it's because of things such as, the evolution versus creation or intelligent design debates or whatever else. But for some reason, at times I found in church that Yahweh as creator or Jesus as the creator God, it's not very like enthusiastically upheld. Like they'll agree to it, but it's not like, oh, this is a really big deal. But instead, I do think that's a challenge for us in our modern days, that we, some reason, I feel, diminish the importance of creation. And that is a very different cultural value that when we read materials back in the 1st century BC, 2nd century BC and onward, that creation is a very big deal to the Jewish writers and to the Jewish thinkers of that time.
And I'm reminded of the Acts 17 line in 1724, the God, the Theos, who created the world, is how Paul introduces Yahweh to this group in Athens. So if you're, again, what we're getting at in a DCW podcast is that the word Elohim is a bit plastic. I mean, it's rubbery. Which Elohim are you talking about? Which Theos, New Testament, are you talking about? And I'm surprised how many times when you go looking for it, as you're saying here, the Theos who created the world is a back hip pocket kind of way of defining Yahweh without saying his name. So big point that we often overlook. Thanks. Number 5 then, in my order here, is this question: will the writer ever change this discussion of one creator, one sustainer? It will be our question, I think, as we read the Bible. It would be anyone's question as you read through the story of Scripture. Is Genesis 1:1 ever going to be challenged by another story, shall we say? In my opinion, and I trust it would be yours as well too, Mike, no, it's not going to change. There might be adjustments to how people think of this or should think of it, but the story itself is not going to change. Number 6, Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5, the famous Shema of Israel, Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our Elohim, Yahweh alone, shows that on the front end of the story, because we're still in Moses' writings there, Israel is told to worship one Elohim among many very real and very dangerous options. Why? Back to Genesis 1:1. And as Lewis hinted at in his article, we don't believe in the story of Scripture. For us, it would be Christianity, because it's helpful, though it is. We believe it because it's true. That's the guts of the matter. Is this true or not? And that's where I think the Shema is aiming its responsibility on the young Israelite nation. You are to worship Yahweh alone, and you can put in parentheses there because he'll be really good to us. But that's not the point. You worship him alone because of Genesis 1:1. All right, so number 7, this is monotheism. This is the stuff of monotheism, the worship of one divine being permanently, while admitting to the reality of other created Elohim, humans, whatever. In other words, everything else that comes from that, if it's created, it doesn't despoil our understanding of monotheism. Number 8. And here it gets into the story. Yet through Genesis, as we have seen, even in our podcast, humans do have contact with the divine world. And so the abiding question, even as monotheists, is which Elohim is acting in whatever story we're coming upon? And this, to me, as we've talked, is kind of where the DCW makes its mark in whether it be this podcast or general discussion, is that our antenna are up, ready to be asking which Elohim are we talking about. And I think that's a fair question. We take the capital G off God in our English Bibles out of respect to Greek and Hebrew, and we realize that they were in a world that had to describe which Elohim, usually, unless it was understood in the context, which Elohim they're talking about. So the God of Israel, or the God who created the world, the Lord God of hosts. Those kind of things are expected ways of wrapping the reader's mind back to the which Elohim question. Okay. Number 9, this contact with Elohim. And by the way, next episode, we're getting into Genesis 31 and 32, which will be the story of Jacob's famous wrestling match with God, is how my Bible has it. I'm going to recommend this was an Elohim, but not Yahweh. So in other words, this question is right in our text. Next time we'll get into that. And here's my point in number 9 again. Their contact with Elohim, be it Jacob or whatever, is still probably an outlier to normal human activity. In other words, I think we have every right to, and I'm curious if you'd agree, Mike, that Adam and Eve and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so far in our Genesis story, lived very long, and I would recommend normal agricultural lives, sheep herding, whatever, normal family relationships. But they have these stories tucked in. We have our stories tucked in of them talking to a snake or a cherubim with a sword or Genesis 6. And you get the sense, because the Bible is giving us these stories in such tight, succession, that this happened every other Tuesday. And my recommendation, and I'm trusting you agree, that they were not normal. I wouldn't call them weird, though. Here's where the difference would be. If I had a snake talk to me, it would bring, it would shock me. You get the sense from Genesis 3 that it didn't shock them. So there must be a little bit of a, we have to do some give and take on how we would define the word normal. Is that the word? Fair enough that Adam and Eve lived 900 and some years, and I think their days were normal. But they do have these visits, and they are, at least, I guess, in their world, somehow expected. Would you agree?
I agree, and I think it's good to stop to just pause here in a moment, just to remind the audience that the ancient biblical audience and the writers, and also just the people of the time that's being written about, like Adam or Abraham, the spiritual world, or the unseen realm, as Dr. Heiser used to call it, they were not separated with like a hard fixed boundary.
Good point. Yeah, thank you.
It was a porous environment. That's the general sense of what we get. Even the way that Eden is described in Genesis and then later on in Ezekiel, it provides and follows this idea that there is a meeting place between heaven and earth, between the physical and the spiritual, and that the two realms are not as divided as we in our modern day, if we even consider the spiritual world real, that they're not as divided as we think they are. But
right, and we talked about that in, is it 28, where the latter vision, that portal idea that now gets even applied to Jerusalem in First Chronicles by David. He calls it the gate of heaven. So yeah, you get this porous sense of normal activity was very normal, but then every now and then they had a visit, and again, what I wouldn't pay with my right arm or whatever to have one. But did I ever tell you that story about doing my dissertation? I'm sure I told you this one, and who knows where I told it to you, but I'm writing my dissertation on other gods, and I would be kicked out of my university office at about midnight pretty much every night when I was doing it, by the security guard who had to just, lock up the building. And so, hey, Ron, or hey, Dr. Johnson, time to go. And I'd, smile and pack up my books, and I'd head down this hallway that was dark. I mean, it was, all the lights off, big, arching ceilings. And I always said, I found myself almost always saying, God, if I could meet an angel or a divine being tonight, it would really help. Because I'm on chapter 4. I need some information about these guys. And I always got the sense that God said back to me, no, you don't. You really don't want to meet one of these, because Daniel was paralyzed when he did. So I say I want to meet them, and then I realize probably not, based on what we see in the Bible. All right, number 10. These divine human interactions that we have every now and then in Genesis, for example, is what caused the second or the two powers in heaven discussion in rabbinic material. Okay. In other words, the rabbis with Genesis 1:1 in mind, they saw these stories. And again, Talmud, Mishnah, this isn't orthodoxy being defined. It's orthopraxy being talked about. In other words, they're just talking back and forth. If you ever read the Talmud or study Talmud, it's conversations between rabbis who are collecting, you almost get the feeling, dissenting and minority opinions. They just love to talk it through. And here's where the two powers discussion starts. It's not because the text taught it, there are two powers. What they had were these visitations, these moments where God appears, Yahweh appears, or the word of God stood in front of Samuel. And it's those moments where the rabbis talked back and forth about this, and the phrase two powers or the second power in heaven idea came up as a discussion point. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Could we talk bibliography at this point, Mike? I'll just hold up where we'll talk about the books that we have read on this. One of the standards that even Dr. Heiser would recommend, it's called by Alan F. Segal, Two Powers in Heaven, Earlier Rabbinic Reports About Christianity and Gnosticism. It's based on a 1975 dissertation, so it goes way back. He is a professor of religion, of Jewish studies at Barnard College. Is Dr. Segal, I think he passed away.
He passed away, I think, in the early 2000s, like 2005, 2008.
But this is the standard. You can tell from, if you're looking, my copy is all messed up because I read it in the hot tub. It always messes with the pages. But his basic position is that the two powers discussion came about through the early and then later periods of the formation of the Talmud, again, rabbis talking. And eventually it was considered heresy by the rabbis. They finally came to the conclusion, if you want to call it that, which again, it's hard to come to a conclusion in Talmud because they're just talking back and forth, but they basically came to the conclusion that the two powers concept, a second power to Yahweh, was considered heresy. And Segal's point is, in the book, he ties that into their disassociation and rejection of Christianity and Gnosticism. And Segal is trying to say, and Dr. Heiser caught this, Segal's point is, there is text for it, though. There is plenty of biblical text to make us wonder what's going on. So they shouldn't, in other words, Segal's main gist is they really shouldn't have turned this out or rejected it out of hand when the text itself presents us with, like a Daniel 7 story, where the Son of Man is given, this kingdom. It's right there. So how they could dismiss it as blasphemy or heresy, Segal says that was a mistake. So,
go ahead. Though he himself did consider it still heretical.
Segal himself?
Yeah, Segal himself. So it's interesting, right? As I was reading through it, it's like, I don't know why. Maybe it's because it's the older style, but I can understand why people would describe this as a tome, T-O-M-E. It is dense.
Right.
But one of the things, if they just want a concise Cliff Note version of why this particular work was so monumental, was that the idea of the two powers has been around for a long time, especially debated within rabbinic Judaism. But the long-standing assumption was that the two powers idea appeared around the 3rd, 4th centuries, that it was a response to Christianity and to full-blown Gnosticism that was going on at that time. And that was the assumption that was held for the longest time. And then you have Segal come with his work and indicating and pointing to all these details and facts that the two powers doctrine, this idea, this variant teaching amongst Jewish communities, it probably existed as early, if we want to say as late early as possible as the 1st century BCE.
BC, right. And that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. If Philo is to be trusted, if the Dead Sea Scrolls are to be trusted, there's plenty of ammunition for a two powers concept to be in Judaism before Jesus ever steps on the earth. Mm-hmm. And that's where I found Segal helpful.
One of the side articles that I read, and ironically, it was because of the second book that we were both reading, the Glory of the Invisible God. By
Orlov here.
Orlov, he had mentioned, I never read Daniel Boyarin's work, but I finally was able to obtain a copy of his article he wrote in a Feshra. And he was basically, he agreed with the most part for Segal's conclusions that yes, the two powers existed way before the 3rd, 4th century. It probably was even, he thinks, goes back to like the 2nd century BC. Mm-hmm. But his pushback with Segal is that he doesn't think it was considered heretical during that time. And that what we see in the Talmud and later Mishnah writings, especially by the rabbis by the medieval times, is that they essentially were defining now what is considered Jewish.
True.
That they were essentially encircling the lines in many ways, just like how Christianity was encircling the lines of like, okay, what is within orthodoxy, what is within proper belief and practice. And that what Segal fails to acknowledge was that the rabbis were biased in that they wanted to define monotheism only one particular way. They wanted to define Elohim in only one particular way, that they were drawing the lines of what was acceptable teaching and what was not acceptable teaching. And that the moment you stepped outside of that, you were not even considered Jewish.
Right.
In the way that they would treat their opponents.
Which is very, it's a hard line for Jews to draw historically. They don't want to draw orthodox lines as much as orthopraxy lines. Here's what we do. A Jew is what a person does, being Jewish to them. And to have lines of orthodoxy has traditionally not been known or a definable aspect of Judaism, much unlike Christianity. I mean, we're very good at drawing lines and having four churches on four corners based on where we draw these lines, but they don't do that. So,
though they still have a version of this, even in modern times in Israel. Last year when I was there for like a post graduation seminary trip that I was able to do, one of the nights that we had was we talked with this Orthodox Jewish scholar, and one of the questions came up of like, well, how does Israel, the nation currently, how would it treat a Jewish person who becomes a Messianic Jew or starts following Jesus, believing Jesus is the Messiah? And her response was, historically and even in current day, that person would no longer be considered ethnically Jewish.
Fascinating. Wow.
And like that even on your citizenship, your ethnicity would no longer be listed as Jewish.
That's incredible.
And we were so confused. We asked, like, but wait a minute, is that the same if a Jewish person becomes a Buddhist, if they become atheists? And her response was no, because historically there has been a long history of atheistic Jews or a long history of agnostic Jews, or Jews converting to other religions, but they're still considered ethnically Jewish, except when you became a Christian. And some reason she did not see anything wrong with this.
Yeah. And to them, you're either Jewish or Christian. You can't be both.
Yeah. And so we were just so flabbergasted. I remember we were all talking in our debriefing afterwards of just trying to comprehend, like, wait, how? But I was confused, but as I'm reading this and then I'm reading what Daniel Boyarin is mentioning in his article, the lines start clicking of like, okay, so this has been a long history where back in, basically the rabbis of the medieval times, they're the ones that survive out of the whole entire, sectarian battles from the 1st, 2nd century, right? You had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, all these other faction groups. They're the ones that survive. They're the ones that are able to leave, and they are the ones that felt responsible of, we have to hold the Jewish people together. And so they felt it was their responsibility to define the the borderlines of what was considered Jewish and not Jewish.
And one of those lines is Jesus the Messiah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mention the other book. I don't have it, in hand. You sent me a PDF of it. What's the name?
Israel's Lord, Yahweh as Two Powers in Second Temple Literature. This just came out this year by David E. Wilhite and Adam Wynn. Both of them are professors, I believe, Wilhite is at Baylor yeah. and Wynn is at Samford University. It's essentially this. Anyways, we can go into this a little bit later, but if anything, I would say their research came the closest to, or even superseded what Dr. Heiser did in his Two Powers course in Awakening. Because his stuff was essentially like, this is what he had found just from his own cursory research and reading. They documented it and they went further. Yeah. And so this was a fascinating read for me. It was really cool just to see something that was this modern, like just literally it's hot off the presses from a few months ago.
And a bit spendy, right?
Yeah.
Once you get into the discussion, of course, of Two Powers, you get into other related subjects, just even defining what a deity is and those kind of things. So my library, I've collected these over the years, and again, it doesn't say Two Powers on the title, but it's going to get into the question of Genesis 1:1 and the appearance of manifestations of Yahweh and all that, like The Hebrew God by Bernard Lang. I really enjoyed this. It's called The Origin and Character of God, Ancient Israelite Religion Through the Lens of Divinity by Theodore Lewis. I think he's at Princeton, if I remember. Johns Hopkins. I mean, it's thick, and but does a great job in just giving the background. Again, it does for me, it did for me, or has, as I read it, it just reminds me how little time we spent in college and even seminary. As Dr. Heiser had complained, how much time do we really spend on the doctrine of what does it mean to be a Elohim? And how does that work, right? I mean, we just so quickly run to the capital G God and, start our systematic courses right there. But, that kind of book helps. Mark Smith, he has written a lot on the history of Israel's monotheism, the early history of God, Yahweh, and the other deities in ancient Israel. I love this title, What is a God? Anthropomorphic and non-anthropomorphic Aspects of Deity in Ancient Mesopotamia by Barbara Neveling Porter. Again, there's so much to read. It's just, when do we have time? The Origins of Biblical Monotheism by Mark Smith. These are not evangelicals, by the way. Mark Smith is not an evangelical. Who is an evangelical, though, and is getting into the fray is Michael Bird. And he has a book that just came out a couple years ago called Jesus Among the Gods, Early Christology in the Greco-Roman World. Great reading. I mean, Bird's just a great writer. And I've enjoyed it. I've, again, only gotten up to page 129. Jesus and the In-Betweeners, chapter 4. Yeah. Comparing early Christologies and intermediary figures. And I don't know why I wrote wow in the opening paragraph, but I did. Oh, he's quoting Philo. My point is that, if you want to get into the bibliography behind Two Powers, you can find it either in the title, Two Powers in Heaven by Segal, or as you read voraciously on other topics of ancient Near Eastern religion and biblical history of monotheism. And here's where Mike, again, he gave us a bibliography by the time he passed of like 6,000 items. That bibliography was what Mike put together to say, guys, I'm not creating this out of thin cloth. This has been around a long time. Many people have talked about this. Here are 6,000 books to read on the subject. And I'm connecting dots that we needed to do. And frankly, an evangelical hadn't. And I say this shockingly again, but Mike didn't say this, but here's how I see Mike. Mike is the first one to connect it for evangelicals, right? He did us that service. So I got to get back to my list here. I'm on number 10. When I said these divine human interactions now that we've even seen in Genesis is what caused the two powers controversy to get its feet in rabbinic discussions. What do we do with these moments when a human will meet a figure that speaks for Yahweh, for example? All right, number 11. The two powers question did not arise, and this is kind of repeating what I just said, but I'm trying to clarify. The two powers question did not arise from biblical teaching that explained how this might work, but from stories where Yahweh or an agent of Yahweh appeared in a story giving the narrative impression that Yahweh was, well, two places at the same time. He had given his power to someone else, that his authority rested in someone besides himself. That's the kind of questions we come up with. For example, like in Genesis 18, and we did this in our podcast, verses 2, where 18:2 has three men showing up to Abraham's door. And then in 18:13, Yahweh said, comma, and you get this, one of the three speaking as it were, he was Yahweh. That was one of those principal moments in rabbinic discussion. Is that a second power? Or how do we even define this moment? In Exodus, and there's many passages, but another one that's famous is Exodus 24, 9 through 12, where Moses and the 70 elders of Israel went up on Sinai and, quote, they saw the Elohim of Israel. And then something goes on here, which, again, is just bizarre to our minds. But what's going on here, said the rabbis, is this a second power, or is Yahweh somehow showing up on earth while still residing in heaven or something like that? That's number 11. Number 12, again, just thinking logically through this. Other stories, and not teachings again, but stories, include where Yahweh is said or shown to share power, like in Exodus 23, verses 20 through 23, where he says, respect my malach, because my name is in him. He will forgive your sins if... And in other words, Yahweh is talking about someone else and how much authority that being has. Again, it's not an angel. Get that out of your vocab. It's a malach. It's a messenger. We're not told more than that. We're just told this malach is somehow, by Yahweh's own admission, listening to the speeches of Yahweh are fascinating. And this one, he says, he has my name in him. And of course, the other one that is a shock to anyone's system is Daniel 7, verses 9 and on, where the Son of Man, or this human being, is brought into God's courtroom by the attending Elohim, and then, shock of shocks, the human being, is given all the kingdoms of the world. So those stories, again, notice the narratives of Scripture don't stop and explain everything. They just give you that story or that vision. And that's where the rabbis found themselves talking back and forth about this second power idea. Number 13.
Ron, can I also add, one of the things when I was reading through Siegel's work was I didn't realize how controversial or just really how disturbing it was for the rabbis to deal with the passage in Exodus where Yahweh is described as a man of war.
As a what?
As a man of war, or like a warrior. Yeah. And it's interesting because as I kept reading, I realized what's going on also in rabbinic thinking is that they were trying to define God as only being transcendent, spiritual. There was never any sort of, that the moments when we read scripture that describes Yahweh in any way that has anthropomorphic attributes, like he has a hand, or he stood, or that he had some sort of body. It was always that the attempt was to explain that away, or that it was just like a figure of speech or something. But that is also part of what's going on in that matrix of ideas about the two powers, is that you have a second figure, a second Yahweh figure who seems to have some sort of physical manifestation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's kind of like what they were also trying to explain or to try to write against.
Yeah. Which, that's why Talmud is so fun to read, because you're dropped into these conversations and you get to converse with them, and you don't know turning the page where it's going to go. It just can, lead off into, why did God invent the gnat? Kind of like, well, what does that got to do with what you're talking about? But that's just how you get the feeling you're sitting over coffee with with Jews who have their Bibles open and are just openly wondering what's going on. Number 13, rabbinical discussion took off from here. How can we start with Genesis 1:1 and the Shema then find ourselves with stories where Yahweh is in two places at the same time or sharing his authority with another being. So that's where this two power in heaven discussion really gets going. Number 14. Quickly denied among the rabbis was the idea of a second power which was contrary to Yahweh, like a dualism, that there's an actual dualistic universe in which we have a good Yahweh and a bad whatever. They quickly said that's heresy. To which we agree. Christians know that the creator God of Genesis 1:1 does not have a alternative sitting behind the scenes, pushing against him. Satan is not the opposite of Yahweh, right? Yeah. So they said, for example, in Talmud, that Genesis 6's divine beings were not afforded independent status. These are not independent deities that can work against Yahweh in some kind of a dualistic fashion. They were rebellious deities, yes, acting against the sole authority of Yahweh. And Yahweh somehow allowed that to happen. And there goes another discussion. How does Yahweh allow something through another agent, shall we say? So this was also the Gnosticism of the first century that then was quickly denied by the rabbis. And again, Christians today, we would agree with their call on this, that we are not in a dualistic world, and Yahweh doesn't have an actual, what word do you want there? Second being that battles against him. This has gone back, to junior high in my own mind. Why doesn't God just get rid of Satan? It would take less than the effort to squish a bug for God to get rid of Satan, and he doesn't. So there must be something in the story, the bigger story, where God wants, and I'm putting the word wants in quotes there, Satan to do what he does. It's kind of like I want to be 20 below in January. How do you know? Because I'm here in Minneapolis. If I didn't want it to be 20 below, I'd move to Boston or West Palm Beach. So we as humans use the word want very loosely. And yet we often don't want to give that to God. We want his world to be black and white, when really, when you think about the stories of the Bible, he's under that same kind of language barrier where we say he wants something, but we got to put the word want in quotes. So that's the dualism issue. That was denied, and we agree. That's my number 14, which, by the way, brings us to next podcast on deciding Genesis 32. When Jacob wrestles, was this a being that was for Yahweh or against him? Or was it even Yahweh, as some would say? So that'll be a discussion then.
Can I bring up, Ron, that I'm looking at Orlov's work, and he only mentions like the word once, complementary. Daniel Boyarin's article that I read, he brings that up more prominently in his article about the two powers, but that the rabbis were vehemently against, yes, oppositional, right? Like a dualistic or oppositional second power. But what Orlov and then Boyarin, they're both pointing out is that the complementary version, though, that appears earlier, like and that's much my number
15.
Yeah, a younger version of the two powers, because eventually two powers will devolve into something like, especially when Gnostics get a handle on it, they start diving into like, well, why not many powers, right? Versus the more principal seed of this idea seems to be more of a complementary version, where you have not this opposition, but like this partnership or this working together of the two powers as one. Yeah, and
that's my number 15. So okay. I appreciate your bringing it up, because you're thinking right with me. Number 15, more challenging than the oppositional idea was and this was discussed again in Mishnah, the concept of loyal Elohim, and you use the word complementary there, Mike, such as the cherubim of Genesis 3, right? The one that's holding its sword, not letting them back to the tree of life. That was a complementary, loyal Elohim called a cherubim in the text. We're not sure exactly what that means. That's why we transliterate the word. And that's a being that's doing Yahweh's bidding. That has not been, that text was not, from what I'm reading, ever challenged as a second power, because that was simply a delegated being. He was given the job, given a sword maybe, saying, hey, you guard this way, you're doing this for me, as though Yahweh was saying this. More challenging, though, would be the Malachim of Genesis 18 and 19, which again have Yahweh speaking as though he's one of them, one of those Malachim there. So that's 15, that we have a challenge. And this is where it does get more interesting in the rabbinical discussion is, well, what about the possibility of loyal divine beings or one other that is not against Yahweh but for him? Number 16. This is Segal's point then. While rabbinical Judaism ultimately condemned all talk of Yahweh sharing his power with another being, or even a hypostasis of himself, they should not have, since it is in the text. Well, again, as you mentioned, Segal's a good Jew, and he does deny that, of course, Jesus would be that second power, I'm sure, and he would even deny, as you're saying, the concept. But what I like about his book is he takes you to the texts, and he takes you to the rabbinical discussions, and more often than not, in my margin, I was noting this doesn't answer the question of Daniel 7, for example. So, in other words, their argument about Exodus 23 and 24, where they meet the God of Israel, that bothered the rabbis. They didn't know what to do with that, so they quickly run into, if I recall this correctly, Mike, the mercy versus judgment side of Yahweh. That he's got two sides to himself, and what Moses discovered was through this anthropomorphism of Yahweh, that Yahweh is both merciful and judgmental depending on which version of Yahweh you come across on a given day. And that's how they got around, seeing the God of Israel, as it were, in Exodus 24.
Yes, so they reduced it down to, I think Segal called it to titles or to, they wouldn't use names because that itself is going to be another problem. But it was some sort of like title, like mercy versus, the title of mercy versus the title of justice. And they try to explain it that way instead of like this anthropomorphized like manifestation, this appearance of a physical being. And it bothered them. It really bothered them, the idea that there would be some sort of physical version or representation of Yahweh.
So, and so this is Segal's point, that the rabbis seem to have rejected two-power talk because of Christianity and Gnosticism. Not because the text just outright denied it. It's just that they, by that point in their traditions and their, just the timing of history, that Christianity and Gnosticism were against it. But, again, as you mentioned, his point in the book is this goes back even earlier than Jesus himself. Mm-hmm. Number 17, for our purposes. Now let's bring it up to where we're living today. And where Dr. Heiser came into this discussion as an evangelical Christian is how two-power talk might fit into, ultimately, the idea of Trinitarianism, or at least Jesus' relationship to Yahweh. So in the course that you can take through the Awakening School, where Mike goes through the two powers in heaven, that's, again, the title of the course, he will bring this into, these texts that we've been talking about, he'll bring them into how Jesus would fit that model based upon the text itself. So the question is, could Jesus have been the second power behind those Old Testament stories that so bothered the rabbis? Could Jesus be behind those? And number 18. Let's do what Christians do here. And again, here, Mike, I can't help but spill my opinions all over the garage floor. So we're going to be... I'm one among many on this, and you are, and Mike was. And so as I give you my opinion on this, I'm not sure exactly where sometimes I was compared to Mike, or even as I would compare to you. So here we get into good Christian discussion where options are available even within a divine counsel worldview, right? So number 18, let's do what good Christians should do here and go to the end of the story. Here's my logic. And I'm not going to read the text for time, but please look them up if you would like. Revelation 4 and 5, it starts with one throne. By the time you get through 5, they have said, these beings around the throne say, who is worthy? And there is one who comes forward worthy to open the scroll. And by the end of chapter 5, you have, I do want to read this one. This, to me, is the most amazing use of a conjunction in the Bible. When you have, and it's in Revelation 5, verse
13.
It's near the end. It's on the left page, left column, right? We all know where the verses are. We just don't know the numbers. Blessing and honor and glory and power. Just imagine how this would sound to the Jewish ear. Be to him who sits on the throne, we know who that is, and to the Lamb forever and ever. And the four living creatures said, Amen. So they worship in Revelation 4 and 5. By the time the story is over, this vision has two beings being worshipped by these myriads of divine beings. Now, backing up from that story, just think backwards and kind of getting back to the Old Testament, and I'm just going to roughly, think chronologically, not of the books, but of the time the books were written. Philippians 2 has the story of Jesus descending from the Father and ascending back to him. You get that V shape that's very clear in Philippians 2. 1 Timothy 3:16, 6 stages of what Paul calls the mystery of our religion. And those 6 stages also reflect a descent, being seen by divine beings, then ascending, glorified, believed on by the world. And you get that V shape in 1 Timothy 3:16. Hebrews 1:1-3. What again, this could take our time, but amazing passage where Jesus is given, again, the title Lord of the Cosmos and so forth. John 1, verses 1, 14, and 18. John's opening diatribe about who Jesus is. And again, can't do it for time, but I'm just thinking backwards. If we end Revelation or end the Bible with two people being worshipped openly, when Genesis 1:1, think of the other end of the Bible, has one being, now you end the Bible with two. How do you get there? And I'm kind of backing my way up through through the New Testament, through these very influential passages that, again, we don't have time to discuss. John 10, I think, is another amazing moment where Jesus does, as though he is subservient to the Father, yet he's one with the Father, and then he even, because of the discussion, brings up Psalm 82. And that would be, again, we need to spend a whole podcast on that. Then backing up chronologically, 1 Corinthians 15, where what would that be, 52 AD, Paul is writing to the Corinthians and explaining the story of how the Son will someday return the kingdom to the Father, 1 Corinthians 15:28. So that's my point about, this is number 18 on my list, is Christians go beyond the rabbis, of course, and we have a New Testament story through which we view Jesus of Nazareth. And we believe that, whether working left to right, 1 Corinthians to Revelation, or the other way around, by the time you get to the end of the story, Jesus of Nazareth has been ascended to the right hand of the Father and is, to quote 1 Corinthians 15, handing the kingdom back to the Father. So it's an amazing story that has two power written all over it, right? Mm-hmm. Number 19, this singular story then of the New Testament does include, and I speak for myself, and I trust you're on board here, Mike, otherwise you wouldn't be here. The New Testament story does include the Father, Yahweh, purposely sharing his throne with Jesus the Messiah. I mean, that's how you would have read it. The Father knowingly, purposefully, decidedly here's the big thing. He doesn't find this being sitting next to him. It's not like a discovery, It's Philippians 2, therefore God the Theos exalted him. That, in other words, you have this story of one creator, Genesis 1:1, deciding to share his throne with his Son in the end. So, should I keep moving? I'm just going through the story, but I don't want to stop you from jumping in.
I think there's right, this is always kind of plagued also within Christian, in the formation of the creeds and other confessions, right? Because of Jesus, right? The way that in the last couple of years I've been able to kind of keep it sort of in order in my mind is that Jesus, in the way that we all normally think of him, that's the incarnation. And one of my professors, Dr. Donald Farburn, he described it as, if we're talking about within a Trinitarian kind of model, God the Son compounded upon himself humanity. And that essentially that person of that Godhead took upon the very nature of humanity. And somehow, because of that combination, but yet also not mixed. Like that's what we're ultimately seeing when we hear these passages of, yes, like he was exalted because of like this amazing moment of that humanity and Yahwehness or Godness is combined. And
would it be fair to say though that that's not said in the story that way? That takes like 2 or 3 centuries for Christians to kind of work through the deity/humanity aspect, and then we tie that in. But listening to the New Testament writers themselves, like a Philippians 2, they don't say it with those.
They wouldn't, and I think we have to caveat that and acknowledge that they didn't, and a lot of that has to do with a lot of these debates had to do with also a lot of Gentile or Greek, Roman, Latin thinking of trying to wrap their minds around what is going on here versus when we look at ancient Near Eastern models, like, okay, they had similar ideas like in the Baal cycle, and that there was something there, but Israel or Israelites or the Jewish people took that and they had their own particular spin or way to explain the nature of Yahweh that was echoing, but also polemically against paganism of their cultures, of their surrounding neighbors.
So we can save that discussion for another one. Again, how do the divine and human natures of Jesus combine? That, again, so much to talk about. But with the 2-power discussion, at least this much we know, as believers, as Christians today, you and I would say that the Revelation, Philippians 2, 1 Timothy 3, whatever, all these stories of the New Testament agree that there is a second power. Yeah. And that power, this is my number 19, does have a Yahweh figure, Yahweh, the Father, purposely sharing his throne with his Son. That's how the story ends. And so now, and that brings me to number 20. We then, as Christians, go back into the Old Testament stories, and with the rabbis, notice that some passages may have telegraphed this sharing of a throne. So Daniel 7, a Christian, to me, I look at Daniel 7 and say, there he is. That's exactly what Jesus will be. Jeremiah 33, 15 to 17, which is like Ezekiel 34:23, which is like Hosea 3:5, if anyone wants to look those up. You have the name David put into the story of the future salvation of Israel, and yet David's dead and gone. Well, how does that work? Except to say, and this is my opinion, that Yahweh through the prophets is predicting, telegraphing that the way that the way Israel will be saved in the end is through ... David. That we're going to have a slot to be filled by a human being. Again, we don't have to discuss deity yet, but you would have come out of those stories saying, I'm going to someday, and this is in Hosea 3:5, we're going to worship two beings. We're going to worship Yahweh and David. It's actually said that way. So it's an amazing moment that's telegraphing the agency, at least, of Jesus in the story. Mm-hmm. And then you get to Psalm 2 and Psalm 110. Yahweh said to my Adonai, and you get these amazing, shall we say, telegraphing moments where we've discussed it at length as believers, and Jews did too, as to who that was. And the believer puts Jesus in that slot, and the Jew today, the traditional Jew, says, no, it's yet to be filled. Number 21, and I'm almost done. So I trust you, Mike, would agree with Segal and Dr. Heiser that the text does have a second power in heaven within it. We, Christians, believe that this is Jesus. Would you sign off on that one? I mean, again, I'm not trying to I'm not trying to trick you, but I'm just saying that when it comes to all this discussion of two powers that you can read, whether it be this stack of books, whatever, the Christian comes away from it, and here's the practical feet on the ground summary. We come away from all that rabbinical discussion by saying, yes, there is a second power. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. That story starts in Genesis 1, goes through stories of, again, these are tough passages, but Exodus 23 and Daniel 7, And they include all the way through the New Testament to Revelation 4. So that second power, I don't think ever is lost from the story. The question is, what do we do with the individual stories of the Old Testament where, and here comes my number 22, and this is my last point, what is left open for discussion is, and this gets very technical, where those appearances of Jesus, and now we're talking a pre-incarnate, without Mary's DNA form of a human, would show up in an Old Testament story. I mean, think about that, by the way. I mean, if we have Jesus showing up in the Old Testament, he doesn't have Mary's DNA because she's not been born yet. Mm-hmm. So he must be of a form that is unique to himself. I'm supposing that he did show up in the Old Testament. He would not be the Jesus of the New, because this is very technical. I'm getting very Nicene on us now. If you're going to talk about the Jesus of Matthew 1, he's got half of Mary's DNA. That's a very specific human being who is now today, somehow through the ascension, whether he's breathing oxygen now or not, I don't know. I doubt it. But that is the Jesus who has been, placed next to the Father. So whatever form we have of Jesus in the Old Testament would have been had a DNA structure absent of Mary. That, again, it sounds technical, but to me, it's an important point.
No, it is an important point. And this is actually, it reminds me again of like what I mentioned about my professor, Dr. Farber. Like he wanted us, whenever we were trying to talk about Trinitarian theology, because Eastern Christianity, they had no choice. They had to deal with Trinitarian theology, especially once Islam started to rise. They had to really, really engage in that topic. And so he made it clear we had to use the phrase God the Son, or God the Father, or God the Spirit, in order to help clarify what we're talking about in our papers. And this is a little bit of the challenge, right? Is that, and there is a little bit of where I remember Mike even saying Jesus appears in the Old Testament, but it's like, well, systematic theologians or Trinitarian theologians would be like, no, that's good. That's going to confuse everything.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And so I think but it's a point that's worth mentioning. Jesus as he appears, or God the Son as he appears in the New Testament, in the incarnation of Jesus of Nazareth, that's a very particular moment. That's like a historical, that will never happen kind of thing again. But what we're talking about of these, some theologians would call Christophanies instead of theophanies. I don't think that however the second person or the second power appeared looked like what he would appear as in, the Shroud of Turin, or however people would imagine Jesus looking like.
Good point.
Whatever the two power manifested in.
That's all I'm trying to say is just remind yourself, if your pastor puts Jesus in Joshua 5 as the commander of Yahweh's army, don't think of him as Jesus of Nazareth. It's got to be a different, physical structure because of the DNA question. So, this is my last point. Then, as I say, left open to discussion is how Jesus, if he did appear, how it would have looked. There is, and I say this happily, I say this after Mike has passed away, Dr. Mike, that do him the honor of disagreeing with him. In other words, don't fall into the habit of believing everything that Mike would have said, because you're dishonoring Mike. Mike would not have liked that. I know he didn't like that. And the best thing we can do as DCW people is talk about the possibilities and realize that there is difference of opinion even on, even as we as a family go into these kind of discussions. So, was Jesus in the Old Testament? Some say yes, in the sense that a being will use the word I as though speaking for Yahweh, and that becomes a discussion. And we went through that, back in the Genesis 18, I think, podcast about how the use of the word I can signal whether that's Yahweh or an agent. Some see an agent such as the captain of Yahweh's host. There's the Joshua 5 story. As well, is that Jesus? It fits. Or could it be a unique being, a unique divine agent that was literally given the task in that time period to be the captain of Yahweh's host? I'm open to discussion. To me, I don't have an opinion. Number 3, this is another option. Some see the "my name is in him" in Exodus 23 as Jesus. Could be. Others don't. Again, good evangelicals disagree on that as to can God use as an agent, whether it be a donkey or a human or a divine being, can he give that being, whoever it is, an agency that would be respectable, shall we say, to the audience as though they're talking to him? That would be my opinion, but I hold it gently. Some see specific hypostases of a second Yahweh. This is where Mike made a phrase that I don't think Segal or any two-power writers have ever used a second Yahweh, have they? And Mike did use that phrase.
He did use that phrase, and more recently, Daniel Boyarin has been, in his writings, he's talked about it as two Yahwehs.
Two Yahwehs, okay. I thought that was unique to Mike.
No. I think Mike got it from Boyarin.
Okay.
And Wilhite and Wynn, they go with that idea as well. The Yahweh as also a second Yahweh.
Okay. And just practically speaking, just so you know, and again, here's where options do exist. I don't take that kind of language. I just find that to be confusing because of the agency stories that we have, whether it be First Chronicles. This was one of my favorites. I don't know if we talked about this one, but and I'll just cite the verses for time, but in First Chronicles 17:4, Nathan is sent by God to David. 5 chapters later, 22:8, it says, "The word of God came to me." David is retelling the story of Nathan, and he puts into it, "The word of God came to me." Well, the word was Nathan, but it just happened to be through, now it's called the word. And then in 28:3, same story, David is being recalling it. He says, God said to me. So do you see to me, I'm noticing the movement of the story where Nathan is then called the Word, which is then says God came to me. So God didn't come to David, Nathan did. But you could say Nathan, the Word, or God, and it would all be because of the concept of agency, able to be said at the same time. So like if I say Herod beheaded John the Baptist, true or false? Yes. Well, no, he didn't. He had an agent do it. But you could say, did Herod kill him, or did the agent, did the soldier kill him? The answer to both is yes. But notice Herod and the agent are two different beings that are not confused in the story. So as a general rule, from me, when Yahweh appears before a person, he is using a delegated agent, be it divine, human, or even a donkey.
I would say, though, Ron, in response to that First Chronicles 8, right, 22:8 verse,
yep.
Nathan is the mouthpiece, but what came out of this mouthpiece was the word, right? And I think, especially this is part of like, and this was actually one of the things that I found really helpful about us as we were studying all this, was I had heard Mike for years say this phrase, matrix of ideas. Mm-hmm. And then I see an echo of it in like Wilhite's work. And it's all basically about like, what is the mental world of the people, right? And so when they know Nathan is there, but something about even the word itself slowly became elevated, like just like the word name or angel of the Lord, like that phrase. That something about it started taking on itself this, in their minds, in their mental space, in their matrix of ideas, there's a sense of agency. And yes, there's the physical human who is delivering the actual audible words, but the word itself, like the concept itself, what's the message itself, started taking on as though it had agency, a personality.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what I would push back is like, yes, I totally see what you mean, that yes, Nathan's there. But for David, who is one of the most ardent Yahweh loyalists, like his way of honoring even Yahweh, even the words that came out from a prophet of Yahweh is this word itself. I don't see Nathan, I saw Yahweh.
Yeah, that's the 28 First Chronicles. He says, God said to me.
Yeah.
So he's able to, again, whether it be the agency involved or does word have this hypostasis, almost personality in front of him. Let me conclude
I think that's just a little bit of like, especially, the word hypostasis that gets used by Will Hyde and Wynne, but I think it's kind of trying to point to this idea that these concepts are taking on upon themselves that this elevation of like agency and worship for the mental world of the Jewish people of that time, of the Second Temple period, and I think that's what's fascinating, right? It reminds me of the moment when John the Baptist says that he had to decrease so that Jesus could increase. And that even the way that he described himself is that he was just a voice in the wilderness. He was a disembodied voice. You're not even supposed to really care what John the Baptist looked like.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
Right. It's that, but he would never claim he was Yahweh, but that he wanted to decrease to such a point that all you heard ultimately was actually the voice of Yahweh speaking to you, and not John the Baptist. And so something about that, like I get what you're saying, because it's hard for us as moderns to not see the physical person or to acknowledge the physical person's there. But there's something going on here in their world of thinking that somehow the physical person could decrease to such a level that you don't see that person anymore.
Interesting. So I'm done with this conclusion. I think for time, we got to wrap it up. Are there two powers in heaven? Yes, in my opinion. By observing the end of the story, Revelation 4 and 5, all creation will someday worship two beings. I think in heaven itself, we will find ourselves worshiping literally two beings. This story is what the New Testament describes, in my opinion. Jesus is sent, Jesus is obedient and faithful unto death, and now he assumes this position next to Yahweh. In this story, Jesus is, here's my opinion, Mike, Jesus is not Yahweh, but he's sent, loved, and honored by Yahweh. And there's no confusion then of persons, at least in the New Testament story that I'm reading. And in my opinion, his New Testament appearance was unique to the story. Half of Mary's DNA for the first and final time is the Hebrews 1:1. God has spoken to us in many ways, but now we get the DNA version of the David person that we've been promised back in Jeremiah. So again, that's me. And so let's begin next time, because for time we can let this one go. But as we get into Genesis 31 and 32, next time, we will meet, here we go. We're going to meet a divine being wrestling with Jacob. And again, because we're in a DCW mindset, we get to ask the opening question, what is this being? Who is he? Don't capitalize the G too fast, shall we say. So how about we save any other thoughts you have about this for that, just to, kind of get our feet wet again as we start in on another text that we took this time, this hour and some, because we have found the two-power idea both in the text. We've now noticed that entire professions today, modern professions, be it Boyarin or Segal, are given to this question, and it's a good one. It's a good one. How does Genesis 1:1 work out in the story? What happens by the end of it? And I'd recommend again to you and our listeners, the fact that you have a throne shared in Revelation 5 is absolutely stunning. Compared to how it starts, the story has a stunning ending. And that's the beauty of, getting our feet dirty, as it were, in the story, is to go through all this stuff. So, good to go?
Yeah.
All right. We will, like I say, begin next time kind of reviewing where this went. So until then, we'll talk to you then. Bye.